Hello everyone, my name is Evie Lupine. Welcome back to my channel, and today I have another video for you all. Today we're going to be talking about daddy dom little girl relationships and daddy dom baby girl relationships. Are they totally separate things that have nothing to do with each other, or are they essentially the same type of dynamic going by different words? And where this got started from and where it ends up is very interesting. It's going to take us on a whole journey of talking about littles and middles and bratting and age play and age regression and stereotypes and misconceptions, and it's fascinating. So where this came from originally was from a post on r/BDSM community, which is a subreddit on Reddit, and it had this to say: can we start making a distinction between daddy dom little girl and daddy dom baby girl? So I've come to realize there's really two big categories of subs inside the circle of daddy dom dynamic that really warrant separate distinction. Most people just commonly say DDLG when referring to any time of dynamic involving a daddy dom, whether the sub is actually a little who loves expression signs of physical age regression, or the sub just likes having a nurturing caretaker to call daddy. Those dynamics play out drastically different, and I think the kink community at large should try to distinguish between them the same way we do for subs who like to brat and subs who don't. Even when talking to kink folks, I have to regularly explain that I'm looking for what I call a DDBG type dynamic instead of a DDLG. I want more the sexy co-ed of ambiguously legal age who adores me and I can care for, and to me, that is more of a baby girl than a little girl. So this is my plea to others to help spread this. Thanks for reading. And so here we are on YouTube, spreading the gospel of OP, talking about little girls and baby girls and everything else therein. And what I want to focus on first actually is what I saw commonly in the comments underneath this post, because it was very enlightening for me as an educator to go, oh, this is how people outside of my immediate little corner of the internet think about this topic. And there were some things in there that made me go, okay, let's talk about this more. So I'm not going to share any particular comments. It's going to be kind of just like broad strokes of what I observed over many comments, because unlike OP, I don't know if they want their ideas shared with the world. And so let's just go over the common things that I saw. I would say number one, the most common thing I saw was people who would say, I'm a dom or I want a dom, where there is a caretaking, nurturing aspect to the relationship, and they are called daddy or I am called daddy, but my partner or myself is not a little. And what people would typically mean when they would say little is they really looked at the visual identifiers of being a little, or like the more pronounced features that you would like commonly see in like maybe social media or something, where, you know, I'm not a little because littles are into like pacifiers and sippy cups and onesies and tutus, and I don't do all of that. I can have baby-ish features. I can be clingy and needy and cry a lot and want to be spoiled and be naive, but I'm not a little. And what I really saw is a lot of people believing that littleness and age play are synonymous. And when you are being a little, that act is age play. And that therefore, when you are in little space, what you are doing is age regression. And we'll talk about that in a moment. I have more things I want to cover first, but just know that I think maybe some of these assumptions are why I think people are going really strongly, oh, I can't be a little because I'm not all of these other things. I would say outside of that, I saw a couple of people who were talking about maybe more what I would call being a middle as opposed to a little, because they didn't like little kid stuff, or they didn't want to do little kid stuff, or identified more with being like a bratty teenager type, and that baby girls were more of that like princessy middle type as opposed to more of a little. I also saw a few folks point out that using the term baby girl was both confusing or also a positive at the same time, or separately, because baby girl can also be just like a really common form of endearment, especially in like the American South, it's more common to call people baby girl. It's just like a random title, even in a vanilla relationship. Whereas other people would say, no, 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 you can't say baby girl because that signals you're role playing even younger than a little would be, and so that's not really even going to actually solve the problem. And then more on the daddy dom side of things, I saw a lot of daddy doms that were resonating more with baby girl because what they wanted was more of that like precocious, naive, very forwardly sexual type of dynamic, which according to them is directly at odds with what DDLG is about, and DDLG is non-sexual, and like daddy dom baby girl can be or is sexual in nature. And so at this point, do I think there should be a separation between daddy dom baby girl and daddy dom little girl? Yes, and also I think we need to do some work to clear up some misconceptions because, oh boy, there were a lot of people in that thread that were so sure that they were not a little at all, and then describing things that to me sounded very little-ish, and then maybe saying they weren't that thing because of stereotypes they had or misconceptions they had. And I have definitely noticed over my time in the community that little and Ageplay in particular has been very compressed down into being more synonymous because very, very, very many people who are littles also do Ageplay, but they're not necessarily the same thing, and age regression in particular is most definitely not the same thing. So let's talk about it. So firstly, I want to talk about the umbrella term because I know that OP does talk about this at the beginning of their post. I do think it is worth repeating for the audience though. Daddy dom little girl is not the umbrella term. The actual umbrella term is caregiver little, to recognize the fact that caregivers come in all different shapes and sizes and styles. Not everyone who has a little is going to be a daddy or a mommy. I do think we could do some work with a more broad label for the right side of the slash because you not only have littles, you have middles as well, and you have probably even other things that exist outside of or between those two things too. So I think we could come up with a better label, and I think at least working towards recognizing CGL more regularly would be a good place to start. Now, the big thing I have to note that I see a lot of people assume about being a little, and this is certainly a stereotype I have as well that I've had to work through quite a bit, is a lot of people look at social media and go, this is what being a little is all about, that it's all about the visual presentation. But in reality, it's not really about that, though I can see how that would be people's assumption, because when you're on social media, be that FetLife, TikTok, Instagram, doesn't matter, what becomes most popular and therefore represents that group is going to typically be the most visually engaging. So you get that impression that being a little is about having a whole decorated room and having a crib and having 30 onesies and a collection of diapers and 60 different binkies and a sippy cup and stuffies and all of that. However, you don't actually really need any of that stuff. And I know what this is like because though I am not a little, I am a pet player. And pet play has gone on this exact same path where because of how visual it can be for people, people assume coming into it, oh, if I want to do this thing, I gotta have the harness and the collars and the bandanas and the tails and all of that business, when you don't really have to. Role play is not typically just about what you are wearing while you do it. That is an enhancement to the underlying feeling you have inside when you are doing the role play, how that role play affects the way you interact with the world, how you communicate with your partner. It's very mental and emotional, and you do not have to do anything visually in order to be doing that particular type of role play. You can be a little and never color anything, never watch a cartoon, because as I will explain in more detail in probably a later part of this video, being a little is not about like wearing a onesie. Being a little is about having this more childlike, more naive way of interacting with the world and expressing that typically through a partnership or just by yourself, and having that sense of like wonder and mystery and enthusiasm and joy that typically goes along with playing as a younger age. And being a little is definitely not synonymous with age play. And this is probably going to be a difficult one to work through, but hear me out, because I personally do believe they are two separate things. Like, you don't have to do age play in order to be a little. As I've already said, they do oftentimes go together, which can be confusing for people, but they're not the same thing. As I already said, being a little is about having that naivete, that precociousness, maybe having that childlike sense of wonder about you. And because of that, it tends to be more of a smorgasbord of different things from different developmental time periods. You'll have littles that do things that are more like kind of toddler-esque, like using a sippy cup, and then also do like older kid stuff, like, I don't know, reading Captain Underpants or something. And so you get people kind of like pick and choose seemingly random stuff that they enjoy from all across different age ranges and different developmental time periods. I think age play is more distinct in that rather than being like sort of an expression of your personality necessarily, it's very much more based on like scene role play and going back to a very particular time period of like toddler, infant, kindergarten, rather than kind of taking and picking random things from all over the place. That's just how I see it. I will say kind of one good test for this that I've seen, that I've heard people talk about, is like when you talk to an age player about what age they are when they're role playing, they go, I'm 3, I'm 5, I'm 7. Whereas little will go, I don't know, I'm little, and then just kind of run off. Like, they're not as like fixed necessarily to having a particular age they go back to. It's more about having that like nebulous feeling of childhood, like I've already said. And so looking at that maybe in more detail and giving an example, one thing I would think of is like, okay, if you asked an age player if they could drive somewhere, their response would be, but I can't drive, I'm only 3 years old, that would be impossible. Whereas a little might respond to that differently by saying something like, well, I can't drive, I'm too little, I'm too small, that's daddy's job, that's the caregiver's job. It's not necessarily that they can't do it because of what age they are. It's that they can't do it because it's inappropriate for the role they're playing in the relationship or in the scene. Does that make sense? Like, maybe that's not really a big distinction to most people, but in my head, I'm like, oh, that makes it a big difference. But, you know, that's me. Now, when I read the description of what OP is looking for or what the commenters are looking for, what comes to my mind isn't being a baby girl. It's actually being a princess or being a middle. And I have videos where I've talked about both of these in detail before if you want to know more about those. But I really think these are already existing labels that get completely overlooked by the community, especially the overlap between bratty behavior and being a middle. So if you don't know what a middle is, I'm going to be talking about this one really soon, but being a middle is essentially like the slightly older version of being a little. Whereas a little is more like elementary school age, toddler age range typically. A middle is more preteen to teenage, like middle school, high school age. And they do tend to be more independent, more bratty, looking definitely still for that guidance, but maybe less into age play typically than a lot of littles are. And their behavior, I think, tends to fall more in line with that kind of like precocious sexuality that a lot of these people in this post are trying to get in their relationships and trying to communicate. And so I think if they don't know what a middle is and they're thinking that little has to be synonymous with age play, if they can kind of look at how you don't have to have age play to have either being a little or a middle, if they can take that and then also kind of figure out more about what being a middle entails, that might better suit what they're looking for. And being a princess is very similar. It doesn't necessarily have anything to do with age play or littles or middles or anything like that at all. It can just be about being needy and being bratty and being spoiled. And again, I've talked about this one in detail in a separate video, so go watch that one down below. There's a link there if you want to know more in particular about princess type dynamics and what that can look like. I also do want to mention here, because now I've talked about age play, littles, middles, brats, and princesses, that there's never going to be one easy way to separate all of these things from each other. I think in the kink community, we run into two parallel issues that I don't think necessarily are perfectly solvable. One is that we don't have enough labels to describe everyone's individual kinks, but then also people kind of pigeonhole themselves into one very narrow label and then feel like they can't escape it. And especially with this side of kink and this type of role play, there's always going to be some degree of overlap between baby girl, little girl, middles, princesses, brats, and all the rest too on top of that. And I think there's always going to be a continuum between baby girls and littles, and I think you're always going to have a conversation about what it is you actually mean by the terminology you're using. And I think the reason why we have labels is to facilitate those conversations, but it's never going to be a substitute, because the way these relationships play out, like, even with being a baby girl, you can't assume they're going to want to be a precocious co-ed. Like, that's definitely not how everyone I know that uses the label baby girl would describe their relationship. So, sorry, you're not going to be able to invent more labels to circumnavigate having to have a conversation about something, but I can see how it might be personally helpful, especially if you don't identify or agree with little, middle, or some of the other labels I've already touched on. Now, as for what I think separates being a little and a middle and an age player and a brat and a princess and a baby girl, and oh man, there's a lot of terms, we're not going to get through all of them today, but I think if you want to focus on separating out a baby girl from the rest of those, I think a really good place to start is with the Loving BDSM podcast. They have a baby girl dynamic, and they talk about it a lot. I actually have an interview I did with them here on this channel. Link to it below. You can go ahead and watch that. It's really insightful if you want a clear example of what actually playing out a baby girl dynamic might look like. Now, I do think at the heart of it, though, when you're looking at little versus baby girl, I don't really think the separation comes down to like baby talk or age play or coloring books. I think it's about how certain underlying traits and behaviors manifest themselves in the relationship, because you can be cute and needy in a way that comes off like being an actual baby or like a little, and you can be cute and needy in a way that comes off like being, I don't know, like a kept housewife or being a trophy wife or something, which I think more closely matches on to being a baby girl, at least in my head. I think let's go ahead and go through a couple of examples of like how different kind of core personality traits that people mention might play out for a little versus for a baby girl. So let's take, for example, acting clingy during a scary movie. A little in that scenario might like completely bundle up under a blanket and hide their head the entire time, or, you know, stick their fingers in their ears and go, oh, I can't hear this, it's too much, or like completely freak out and try to be as close to you as possible and go, what's happening? It's so scary, I don't understand, and like completely going over the top with it potentially. Whereas I think a baby girl might behave in a slightly similar fashion, but not go as over the top. They might still be clingy, they might still need reassurance, but they're gonna more like hold hands the entire time, or they might like put, you know, a head against your chest, but then, you know, they're looking at the movie a little bit, but then when things get hard to watch, they turn towards you and kind of use you to block their vision. It's definitely still being really close, but not to the same extent that a little might express it. Now, when it comes to asking for help, the way that a little might ask for help, or why they might ask for it, is because, well, they're too little to be able to understand it, or they shouldn't do it because they're too little to do it, even when at their actual biological age they would definitely know how to do that particular skill, and in everyday life they probably know how to do it, right? Like they could go, Daddy, I'm too little to be able to use a can opener. I don't know how. Open my beans for me. Like 10 people are gonna get that reference. Let me know if you know what I'm talking about with that one. But it's about sort of looking at things and going, well, I'm too small to know how to do this. I shouldn't do it because it's an adult's job, not my job as little, and it would be inappropriate for me to do it on my own, or I just wouldn't know how to. Whereas a baby girl, I think, would ask for help and be like, Daddy, can you help me do this? Especially when it's more like traditional, like masculine home tasks with the daddy words, like changing a light bulb, or, you know, starting a battery in a car, or taking out the garbage. They might know how to do it. They might even be expected to do it in the relationship, but they're there because they want the daddy to take care of them, and so asking for help doing a thing they already know how to do and could do for themselves mentally is part of what being in a baby girl type dynamic is. It's that caretaking, even though they are self-sufficient enough to know how to do it for themselves. Pampering is a big thing for both littles and for baby girls. When I think of pampering though, for a little, the way that would normally go would be like a big bubble bath filled with like way too many toys, or like going out for frozen yogurt or ice cream, or spending a whole day under a homemade blanket fort watching movies on a laptop or something. It's very much steered towards like younger age range activities and like a little bit of a younger expression in the way that it plays out, or like the topics that the person picks, right? Like for the movie, or, you know, they want to go to the ice cream store and they get like, you know, a double scoop with like sprinkles and cherries and whipped cream and chocolate chips and caramel sauce and chocolate sauce, like just all the toppings, right? Like it's a very littler way of doing it compared to maybe how an adult would do it. Whereas with a baby girl, they can really like being pampered, but typically, again, it's more mature in the way that it's done. They might have a bubble bath, but it's going to be like a luxurious bubble bath, like a glass of wine, and not necessarily a lot of toys sharing the bathtub. And they might appreciate going out to eat, but they prefer maybe a fancy dinner over just getting frozen yogurt and a pound of whipped cream on top. Now, they could also enjoy things like having their daddy pick the venue for where they're going out to eat, or picking out the outfit for them to wear. And they might also enjoy more like beauty maintenance pampering, where it's like, I'm expected to look the best for my daddy. That means he's gonna help me get my nails done, or my hair done, or get a cute new outfit before we go out to this dinner date. Like there's caretaking and pampering, but again, a little more mature, a little bit more adult in the way that it's done. Of course, most of these things can also be done that way by littles, but it goes back to the mental part of it. It goes back to more the mentality you would have while you're doing it in the moment, and how you perceive it and how that connects into your dynamic. Now, one other thing that is popular both with baby girls as well as with littles would be pouting and bratting. And I almost don't even need to explain this one, but I will. With a little that is pouting or bratting, typically that looks basically how a little kid would do it, right? And why they would do it. It's like, you know, having a meltdown from lack of sleep, feeling emotionally overwhelmed, like experiencing that crushing disappointment of them being out of their favorite macaroni shape at the store, or having to do an early bedtime. Like the concerns and reasons for why a little might pout tend to be more that level of disappointment and that kind of expression. I think it can also look like, you know how a little kid will be like, why, and just like poke and poke and poke and poke, and not really take no for an answer, not really like understand what I don't know means. That would definitely be something that a little would brat over. Or it could even be things like, make me, and then running away, blowing a raspberry, and like, you know, more like practical jokey, maybe even forms of bratting, where it's about sort of the direct, very naive teasing, and then like getting the consequence for that. And I think that baby girls can also do some kind of more naive teasing and kind of egging their dominant on. But I think especially with pouting, it tends to look very different. It tends to be more like crossed arms, you know, huffing, going, I didn't want to anyways, or why can't I have this? You know, it's my favorite, and kind of more sort of like spoiled teenager energy as opposed to little kid energy in the way the pouting is done. I also think that baby girls are more likely than littles to like directly question their dominance authority with things like, I mean, what are you going to do about it? Spank me? And kind of like daring them to do it. but then also fully expecting to be spanked on the other side of it. And those are just some of the differences and similarities that I've seen between being a little and being a baby girl. It's a genuinely hard thing to try and verbally communicate what I think the differences are. I know when I think in my head, I think of two very different roles, two very different, like, almost types of people that are doing it in terms of, like, visually. When I think of somebody who is a baby girl versus somebody who is a little, I think of two very different images, but I think that they do have a lot of overlaps though still at the same time, and I think it can be a toss-up between just kind of which label you like better. Maybe your style would fit equally in either category. It's more like, hey, what do you like being called? And sometimes it's really what it ends up coming down to. But I do think they are worth recognizing as two separate, distinct things. I think if I had to come up with like one concrete way of separating the two, how I would think about it is that with a little, they are more directly childlike and more childish with their role play, the things they choose to do, how they engage with their partner. Whereas when I think of baby girls, what comes to mind is more of an adult who knows they're an adult, who wants to be kind of like cutesy, playful, immature maybe in some of their interactions, the way that they talk to their partner or the things they do. But they're doing it because they want to prompt their partner to be like more affectionate and caring and like pay attention to them, as opposed to being because it's about like some kind of like underlying expression of like a childish personality maybe. I don't know if that makes sense to everyone, but it's about kind of that balance of like how childish the person is being, with like a certain degree of childishness being kind of more like a baby girl and a greater degree being a little bit more like being a little. But again, I don't know, I am certainly not an expert, because at the end of the day, we define the terms do not define us. We have to find the labels that work best for ourselves and we think are sort of like a best close fit and resonate with us. But the community, individual people are likely to have a different understanding than our own personal interpretation, which is why, once again, having conversations about this is so important. That's about it for today, you all. I hope that you all enjoyed this video. I would love to know your thoughts in a comment down below. What do you think about baby girl relationships versus littles? Do you have one of these relationships? What do you think about it? What are your thoughts? What are your feelings? Let me know what you're thinking about in a comment down below. Once again, if you did enjoy this, if you're not already, please do subscribe, because I make videos twice a week about all sorts of kink and BDSM related subjects. And finally, if you want to really support what I do, the best you can do that is with Patreon. A link to that will be down below. If you do already support me there, thank you so much. It means the absolute world to me. And until I see you all next time, I hope you have a great yesterday and a great rest of your week. Bye-bye.